you agreed to be on with me. This is something that in the past few months I haven't been paying as much attention to, and the coronavirus especially. I saw your interview on Twiv recently, which I used to listen to religiously, and uh, and realized, oh gosh, I've really missed a lot,
Well,
because
it's hard for anybody to give full attention to this virus and the virus story continuously. It's hard for me. I'm sure it's hard even for Vincent Racaniello. Um, but
definitely.
things keep happening.
Something that struck me about your interview with them too is that you must have had to kind of convince yourself to keep up this story too, uh, as the news attention was declining. Was that a challenge at all for you?
Yes, it was. I mean, I finished this book, Breathless, about a year ago right now, and sent it to my publisher, Simon and Schuster. And there was more work to be done. There was revising, fact checking, a lot of polishing and tweaking. But essentially, I had to end the story in December of 2021, at the point when the latest new thing on the horizon was Omicron.
Mm.
And now we know Omicron has just flourished, blossomed into this vastly diverse tree of different viral subvariants, and people are still trying to figure out whether those are simply more transmissible or also more virulent than other strains of the virus, and to what degree people can become reinfected. And all sorts of things are going on still with the politics, the economics, and the public health of COVID-19, but also with the viral evolution, the pure virology of SARS-CoV-2, the virus. And in the meantime, I've had other responsibilities and other things that I've been working on, so I haven't been able to stay on that subject 24/7. And then, of course, I've been doing a book tour for a couple of months off and on. So it is difficult, but what I hope I've done in the book Breathless is give people principles by which to understand the ongoing story of this virus.
And the last time we spoke was maybe a year and a half ago when I was doing my podcast on COVID. And eventually, I just kind of found that the interest in just talking about COVID was starting to taper off. And so I tried to kind of broaden it, and eventually got really interested in just aspects of critical thinking and conspiracy theories.
Mm-hmm.
And you had mentioned that you were working on the book back then.
Mm-hmm.
That was a part of the topic of discussion, even though we focused on spillover. But I didn't realize that a lot of your book was going to be focusing on the different schools of thought, kind of the different ways in which people are thinking about this, both from the scientific community and from um, politics at large. And this is one of those really odd things that has probably happened a lot of times in the past with pandemics, where you mix politics, culture, and science, right?
Yes. Yeah. And COVID-19 has turned into sort of a test case of some of the challenges that you just mentioned, some of the challenges that we're going through that affect our relationships with democracy and our government, our relationships with science. So COVID-19 is not a small thing, but it's small compared to those broader spheres, those broader contexts. Just how the general public thinks about science, uh, how we employ or do not employ critical thinking, not just with regard to science, but with regard to politics and history too. And people have asked me, particularly over the last 2 months when I've been talking about this book a lot, uh, one of the questions I've heard over and over again is, now that we have such extreme science denial among so many people, rejection of vaccines, rejection of the science, the virology of COVID, skepticism, to put it politely, toward public health leaders like Tony Fauci. How do we deal with that? How do we reverse that? How do we reverse this storm of conspiracy thinking, of preference for the dramatic story, whether it's supported with empirical evidence or not? How do we get back to critical thinking? And one of the things I've said is, I don't know how we turn that aircraft carrier in terms of adults, but in terms of educating children, I think it's vastly important. Kids 10, 11, 12 years old, to educate them and help them educate themselves in science and in history and in critical thinking. Now, how do you educate an 11-year-old girl or boy in critical thinking? And the best answer I can give to that is that you help that young person understand that when someone, an adult wearing a white coat or an adult wearing a suit and tie or anybody, asserts something, the virus was engineered, the election was stolen, the moon is made of green cheese, that 11-year-old can say, at least to herself, if not to the adult, how do you know? How do you know? How do you know the moon is made of green cheese? And the title of your podcast now is part of what I just described. And I love that you're calling it what you're calling it. What exactly is the title now?
Yeah, it's what's your evidence?
What's your evidence? There we go.
Yeah.
That's the question for that child to ask. How do you know? What's your evidence that the moon is made of green cheese? That 9/11 was an inside job and a conspiracy, and those buildings fell because they were sabotaged. What's your evidence? How do you know? We can give that tool to kids.
That's right. Yeah, I think, and you mentioned the concept of falsifiability in your interview with the TWIV uh, virologist too, Karl Popper. That concept is so it's complicated because we haven't really been exposed to it very much. And the idea of, well, how do you falsify something if it's not false, right? But it's really that there's this standard that we have that if you can't even conceive of it being falsifiable, the statement that you're making, like there's nothing that I could say to you in terms of evidence that would overturn your mentality. If it's something like that, then we shouldn't entertain it. And that takes some time to explain, but I think kids could get that.
Right. Yeah, if it's not falsifiable, it's not useful in a scientific discussion, and maybe it's not useful in a political discussion either. For instance, to get back, when we don't, I know we don't want to talk here just about the virus, about SARS-CoV-2, but it is for me the foreground exemplum of these things. So Zhengli Shi is the scientist at the Wuhan Institute of Virology who studies coronaviruses. She is the one who has, over the last 17 years, identified a number of dangerous coronaviruses and told the world about them. These are dangerous coronaviruses. We should watch these. She is also the one who is accused of having let this virus, the COVID-19 virus, leak from her lab, although she has said that this virus was never in her lab, and there's no evidence that this virus was never in her lab or anything that could have been engineered through gain-of-function research or passaging or anything else that could have become this virus. So, and she has told journalists, she's told John Cohen of Science, she didn't have this in her lab. She's told Jane Chi, a Chinese and American journalist based in Beijing, who has published in Scientific American and elsewhere, she never had this virus in her lab. She's told me, Zhengli has, during a 2-hour Zoom conversation, she never had it in her lab. She, as I've said elsewhere, she could be lying, and some people say she's lying. But if your position is, this virus leaked from a laboratory, it leaked from her laboratory, when she says it was never in her laboratory, she's lying, then you have a non-falsifiable hypothesis. She could come forward and she could say, here are all my laboratory notebooks. This is it. You can look at them. There's no sign of this virus having been in my lab. Here are all my notebooks. Then if you say, well, she's lying that these are all her notebooks, that's not useful in conversation. That's not a falsifiable hypothesis. If you say whatever she says is a lie, then the useful conversation is over.
And we see that with other conspiracy theories, especially the big ones, JFK and 9/11 commissions. As Philip Sheenan points out, the things that are excluded from those reports oftentimes have to do with embarrassing aspects of government. It's not malfeasance. It's sometimes, the FBI and the CIA, they couldn't stop the hijackers, and they also were, the Saudis had some kind of a Saudi royal family had some very tenuous connections to some of the hijackers in the sense of, like, the ambassador's wife was giving some money to these guys and probably didn't know that they were Al Qaeda. But those aspects don't make it into the commission, so people think, well, there must be conspiracy behind it. And
Yeah.
you point this out with the fact that it's possible that in China, that because they weren't regulating the Wuhan food market well enough, then that might be what is causing them to be a little bit less forthcoming with evidence. Or how would you describe that?
Yes. Well, I think that's a hypothesis that has gotten less attention than it deserves. People were talking about the lab leak hypothesis, the natural origins hypothesis. Well, part of the natural origins hypothesis is that it probably the spillover probably occurred in that market, and there was an intermediate wild animal that had picked up the virus or several viruses from bats, and those viruses may have recombined either in the bat, switching segments, either in the bat or in the intermediate animal. And people were exposed because that intermediate animal was on sale as food in the Huanan seafood wholesale market. But it was illegal for that wild animal to be on sale as food in the Huanan seafood wholesale market. There are laws and regulations about that now. Some domestically raised wild animals at that point could be sold legally, but not wild caught wild animals. And we're talking about wild animals such as raccoon dogs, porcupines, palm civets, bamboo rats, ferret badgers, etc. There was evidence that though the individuals of those species on sale in the market had been wild caught. They had gun injuries, they had trap injuries. All of this has been published in the scientific literature. So if the virus leaked from one of those animals, spilled over from one of those animals into humans, then somebody who had been corruptly ignoring the laws and looking the other way at that trade that was going on in that market was in a lot of trouble, was responsible for the beginning of this thing. And I think it's very plausible that that is the reason why scientific officialdom has not been transparent about this. The market was closed, emptied, and sterilized essentially on January 1st, 2020. And when that was done, precious evidence was lost about what happened. And I think that it's plausible. And in this, I follow a national security writer named Gigi Gronval, who was published on this, that it's possible that this whole thing does involve some cover-up, but it's not a cover-up of a lab leak. It's a cover-up of a market leak.
Yeah. It makes so much sense. And, something that occurred to me when you were in the book is that by looking at the different explanations that are out there, the lab leak hypothesis, lab leak, that is the market leak, the just the regular spillover aspect, cover-up elements, that it comes down to something that Vincent Bugliosi used to say, which is, if you don't know the truth, I mean, most of us don't have access to the direct truth, right? You as a science writer, you kind of have to learn on the go too, and to an extent, you have to decide who you're going to trust. And he said, the best thing you can do is compare the different sources. How credible are these two different sources that we're looking at? And that's
Right.
based on the amount of evidence that they have. And as you point out, there really isn't evidence for the lab leak hypothesis by comparison to the quantity of evidence that there is for this natural spillover.
Right. That's right. Yeah. Is it possible? Is it theoretically possible that there was a lab leak? Yes, it's theoretically possible. Is there evidence to support it? No, no. There are circumstances. There's circumstances that people put together into narratives and say this could have happened and this could have happened. Gain of function research is irresponsible. It's risky. Well, even if you think gain of function research is risky, even if you think it's irresponsible, you still need evidence that gain of function research, in fact, with empirical support, is what led to this, and that's where the chain of inference has a big gap. There is no such empirical evidence. So, should we close our minds to that hypothesis? No, we should keep them open, but we should keep researching, keep looking for this virus in wild animals. Keep investigating however you're going to investigate the possibility of a lab leak, or at least entertain that possibility until we have more and more and more persuasive evidence in support of one hypothesis or another. And that's, as you know, that's the way science proceeds. A hypothesis becomes more and more firmly supported, and eventually people trust it as established. But science is always provisional, and one of the obvious examples, there are two obvious examples of this, and that's the Ptolemaic model of the universe versus the Copernican model of the universe. The Ptolemaic model worked real well for, I would think, 1,500 years. It seemed to explain how the heavens moved. They all moved around the Earth. All rotated around the Earth, and it took some hedging and tweaking and some epicycles to make that model work. But for centuries and centuries, it was made to work. And then Copernicus, with help from Galileo and Kepler, established no, that's not how it works. Our solar system rotates around the sun, not around the Earth, and the universe doesn't rotate around anything. Certainly doesn't around our solar system. And then the other instance is Newtonian physics versus Einsteinian physics.
Right. It's kind of like the Kuhn's concept of the scientific revolutions, where and a lot of people think that what he's trying to say is that, well, we just keep proving that we don't know anything. But actually, it's kind of closer to the concept of on the shoulders of giants, right? You have to know that previous information, and then you build from there. Even Einstein is kind of referring to previous scientists, and
right.
And it's not like he's inventing this out of whole cloth, out of his own brain.
Right. Right.
And, I think that if I'd recommend people who are listening, because this is really for more of a local audience, the book Spillover, as well as your Ebola book. Well, Ebola book, that's kind of a section of the Spillover book, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And then your section of the Chimp in the River, also that's a separate book, but that's based on
right. Yeah. Yeah.
From Spillover. Those two were so informative for me. If anybody's interested, I mean, I recommend to get Spillover, but the AIDS section I've been able to turn that into basically an 18-part lecture in my classes, where I look at it kind of as threshold events, big changes that have taken place, and how you see how it's related to things like imperialism and industrialization, but also things going on in the United States. And this can be similar.
Yeah, I'm very glad to hear that. Thank you, Chris. Yeah, that's that section. It was a chapter in Spillover originally, like 100-page chapter. And I forget if it was my British or my American publisher said, why don't we publish this freestanding as a book? You can update it a little bit. You can write a new introduction, et cetera, and make it freestanding. So I did, and that became The Chimp in the River. And I think that's probably the most important 100 pages I've ever written.
Oh, yeah, it's just excellent. And then, of course, is your choice of that title related at all to that 1,000-page book about, I think it's just called The River, right?
That's right. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Edward Hooper, I think. Hooper or Hopper, but I think it's Edward Hooper, The River, a 1,000-page book. His conspiracy theory view of the origins of the AIDS pandemic, putting it all down to vaccine field trials, clinical trials in Africa, supposedly, of a vaccine that was supposedly made from from chimpanzee cells rather than monkey cells, and accidentally contained the chimpanzee virus that became HIV. Only problem with this hypothesis is that there's no empirical evidence to support it. But it takes you 1,000 pages to learn that. And I've read that 1,000 pages and thought, no, nope, not persuasive. And then there's another book, a wonderful book called The Origins of AIDS by Jacques Pepin, a physician and epidemiologist, French, I believe, that gave me some of the, and I cite him in the book, gave me some of the information and the key links to allow me to tell a very different story of the ecological origins of the AIDS virus.
And Dorothy Crawford has a book on the origins as well, right?
I don't know her book on the origins of HIV. I've certainly read her on the subject of viruses generally. She's a very respected name.
Yeah, she has one, I think it's called The Virus Hunt, and I'm not sure which one came out first, hers or yours. But yeah, books like that, it shows you just how ecological and historical this is too. That it and kind of to relate it back, there's a lot of similarities because there are a lot of simian immunodeficiency viruses too. A lot of SIVs that are out there in all different types of primates, right? From monkeys to the great apes, like the chimps. And so it makes sense that if that's the case, then there are lots of coronaviruses too. As you point out in the book, there's evidence that there's hundreds of different coronaviruses in these bats that are found, and that only a small sliver of them actually can affect humans. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. And as some scientists, I can't remember which one, more than one probably, have said, nature is performing gain of function research all the time.
Yeah.
It's called evolution by natural selection.
Yeah.
And nature is, nature designs viruses that work. And there is evolutionary pressure for viruses to find new kinds of hosts. So some of them are broadly adapted so that they can leap from one species to another. That's one way of staying alive. It's like, hopping from one block of ice to another in an ocean where climate change is melting the blocks and reducing the ice that a polar bear can work from. That's an analogy that kind of takes us into left field, but
no, sure. Well, and it kind of reminds me of a lot of the instances in Spillover that you're talking about are actually, because that was written before the 2013 to 15 Ebola outbreak, right? Things like Hendra, Nipah, Ebola, and even things like H5N1. For those people who don't know, the bird flu that came from chickens right out of Hong Kong in the 90s.
Which is one to watch. It's one I'm watching, and a lot of scientists are watching right now.
Oh gosh, yeah, high case fatality rate. But in those cases, these are really high case fatality rates, but a lot of times they haven't spread very far. Like Hendra killed 1 or 2 people, right?
Hendra it maybe killed 3 or 4 by now, but high fatality rate, like 50%, but very low case numbers because it's rare for it to spill over into humans, and it's not, as far as we know so far, transmissible from one human to another.
Yeah, and it just shows that even in these little places where you have these viruses that emerge, that shows you that there's so much more potential that nature has to inflict these viruses on us. But it also so often has to do with our interaction with animals, whether hunting or farming them.
That's right. Yep. Those are the situations that put us into contact with wild animals and the viruses that they carry. And therefore, those are the hotspots of spillover and the things that raise the risk level. Another aspect of that, you mentioned H5N1 influenza, bird flu, which is now circulating, comes from wild birds, as all influenzas A's come from. The original sources are wild aquatic birds, and then they get into poultry, often in Southern Asia. and then from poultry into humans, and sometimes they recombine with other viruses and become very effective human pathogens. So now H5N1 is this very dangerous bird influenza, gets into chickens, gets into poultry of all sorts, and kills them, and occasionally gets into a mammal, a porpoise, a dolphin, a fox, and seems to have a high case fatality rate in them, and occasionally gets into a human and seems to have a high fatality rate, but does not yet spread human to human. But talk about evolution constantly working on gain of function experiments. Now that we have that influenza, H5N1, circulating not just in wild birds, but in domestic poultry, those domestic poultry are circumstances in which the virus gets many chances to replicate, and therefore many chances to mutate, and therefore many chances to just accidentally acquire a mutation that would make it transmissible in humans. And you probably know this already, Chris, but your audience probably is not aware. We have 26 billion chickens on this planet. 26 billion chickens. That is a big petri dish for the cultivation of dangerous avian influenza viruses.
Oh my gosh. And they're being shipped around the world and things too.
They're being shipped around the world. People are coming in contact with those birds every day. So that is a problem.
Definitely. And of course, we can look to the Spanish flu outbreak 1918. They're not entirely certain about the chain, but they certainly know that it probably came from waterfowl somehow first, but then affected pigs or humans first. Pigs and humans could have, it could have mutated within those two species as well. It's kind of hard to tell, but the fact that there's so many pigs too ends up making it much more possible.
That's right. So the industrial scale animal husbandry is a risky behavior that we engage in. Somebody recently told me there is, I think it's in the city of Wuhan, there is a huge pig abattoir that's being built that will contain, I don't know, I can't remember how many hundreds of thousands of pigs at a given time. Again, a risky situation.
Definitely. And something that you point out in the book very clearly is that you have things like SARS and MERS, which have these high case fatality rates, MERS more so than SARS, and that a lot of people think, well, those just, especially with SARS, they think, well, it just died out because it didn't have the good, the ability to spread as quickly because of its high case fatality rate. But one of the scientists you spoke to, or doctors you spoke to, said it has to do with actual containment. How do we tell to what degree it's the people in the public health community that are acting on this to contain it, and to what degree it's the survivability or the suitable, or the whatever you want to call it, the fitness of the virus itself?
Yeah, well, it's not always easy to tell. Although with the case you mentioned SARS and MERS, both of them, of course, are coronaviruses, previous coronaviruses. SARS, very dangerous virus in 2003, emerging from China. MERS, very dangerous virus emerging from the Arabian Peninsula in 2012. Both of which had high case fatality rates. SARS killed about 1 person in 10 among known cases. MERS, the rate was higher than that, was around 30%, I believe, of fatalities in known cases. So really dangerous viruses, would have been much more dangerous if they were highly transmissible from human to human. Right. With SARS, it got to these big cities around the world, came out of Hong Kong, got to Beijing, got to Singapore, got to Hanoi, got to Bangkok, and got to Toronto, and started infecting healthcare workers because they didn't know what they were dealing with. They had people who were having respiratory crises. Oh, let's intubate this guy. So, 5 people gather around, and there's an obese man who's having an acute respiratory crisis, and they're trying to get a tube down his windpipe, and the healthcare workers are not wearing PPE because they don't know what they're dealing with. That's what happened with SARS-1, and it killed a lot of healthcare workers, but only 800 people in total died, 8,000 infected. And then some people say it burned out, but it didn't burn out. According to the public health people that I know, it was stopped by extremely robust, even draconian public health measures of containment, so that it couldn't spread further. Now, how do you know in a given case to what degree it was containment, public health measures, and to what degree it was just the virus didn't have enough capacity to transmit, wasn't fit enough, as you rightly said, in Darwinian terms, wasn't fit enough? Well, I think the answer is it's probably always going to be both.
Yeah.
But if you're going to assume anything, don't assume that you stopped it. Assume that you tried to stop it and you were also lucky.
Right.
So you need to try harder next time, because you might not be lucky. And with COVID-19, we weren't lucky. We were very unlucky.
This question that I have is the one I've had from the beginning when this first started to spread differently than SARS and Ebola and the 2009 swine flu and all that. Because my thinking at the time for all of those was, well, okay, this is going to be like anything else. It's going to, that I've seen in my lifetime at least, which I was born in 1974. And so I'm using these reference points for all these other viruses and thinking, well, it's going to really stay contained to some place, and then it's going to burn out because public health officials have, I have trust in them. And then in this case, I think, well, what can we really learn? Because you have China, right, that had these severe lockdowns in the beginning, and they were seen as a case, a perfect case for containing COVID, whereas with us, we were much more open, and so some European places like Italy as well, people were talking about different cultural attributes, right? The Italians are very social, and their mayors were screaming at their people to stop being so social for COVID. So that's what I mean, like, with that other question about how the culture and the science are kind of intertwined. And I'm wondering how we're going to learn lessons from this if we don't know exactly what worked.
Yes, well,
and where.
We certainly need to do that. We need to collate the lessons of this and understand what happened. And there is a group under the World Health Organization called SAGO, Scientific Advisory Group on Origins, SAGO, of pandemics generally. And there are a number of very distinguished scientists on that panel who are working, communicating, conferring with one another, seeking evidence to understand A, what happened with COVID-19, B, what happens generally with spillovers that become pandemics and how we can prevent. We probably can't prevent spillovers, but we can hopefully prevent spillovers from becoming pandemics. So SAGO is working on that. Carlos Morel of Rio de Janeiro is on that. I think Supaporn Wakarapluezidi of Bangkok is on that. A number of other scientists. And we have to hope that they will glean wisdom from this. In the meantime, this is maybe worth mentioning, there was also a proposal, there was a bill in the Senate, the U.S. Senate, that came out of the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Policy. Anyway, it's called the HELP Committee, the Public Health Committee in the Senate. Chair is Patty Murray, Democrat of Washington. Minority Leader is Senator Richard Burr, Republican. And they created a bill called the Prevent Pandemics Bill, for the federal government to take a series of measures to prevent future pandemics. We obviously need to do that. That bill languished in the Senate for months. It was introduced back in March. Nothing happened. It was controversial, I think, because there was one section in it that said, we will establish a commission, sort of like the 9/11 Commission, the Warren Commission, to investigate the origins of COVID-19. this one in particular. And this commission will consist of 12 American citizens appointed variously by different members of Congress. The Senate majority leader gets to pick two, and then the minority leader gets to pick two, and then somebody else picks two, and it's supposedly bipartisan, but you could sort of imagine how political this body would become.
Yeah.
And I was asked, just between us and your audience, I was asked to write an op-ed about this for the Washington Post, which I did, warning about this. But then the op-ed has never been published because that bill was inserted in into the omnibus bill, the big $1.7 trillion general governmental support bill that was just passed, and the commission provision, that section, was dropped from it. I guess that was the poison pill. I wasn't the only one who thought that was just a terrible, terrible idea.
Yeah.
So there was no point in printing the op-ed because, it
ended up dying anyway.
It ended up dying a well-deserved death anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. I agree. Right. I was thinking, well, what are we really going to learn from this that we can't learn from the types of committees that are being produced or the studies that are being produced, like
Right.
You're citing in the book?
Right. And my point is that absolutely we need to investigate, we need to think about, we need to learn more about the origins of this coronavirus, but we don't want 12 politically chosen non-scientists to be the one considering that question. We want molecular virologists and epidemiologists to be considering the evidence of that question.
Yeah, well, we have people like Rand Paul who have such a big voice out there that because he's a doctor, I think he's a physician, right? And
I think he's an optometrist.
Okay, there you go.
I love my optometrist.
Sure,
but
they're not virologists.
Be the one to figure out the origins of the coronavirus either.
Yeah, right. Well, and in some ways, I think your book is an exercise in how to evaluate these emerging diseases too. And as opposed to a spillover, where you have a lot of different examples, a tapestry of what's going on in the world at the time, emerging diseases, right? As opposed to with this one, you have something that is happening right now to us, and your book is a good guide for how we can learn more about it too, not just what we've already learned, but how we can think about it moving forward, especially because you don't discard each of the theories that you find probably less plausible. I think you point out the degree to which they could be, especially the idea that somebody working at the Wuhan lab, it's possible that person who had been working with these viruses, it's possible, although there's not evidence for it, could have gone to one of these markets too. Things like that, and maybe spread it that way, right? Things like that are possible, but again, if you have to invent it in your imagination without any evidence, then why would we just assert that?
Right. That's and I described that in Breathless. And maybe I should say for your audience, this new book, Breathless, it's written using the voices of 95 experts around the world, whom I interviewed on Zoom during the first half of 2021. And then I used their voices to tell the story in narrative form of the origins and evolution of this virus and its fierce journey through the human population. And I tried very hard. I do have a point of view in the book, and we've been describing that. I do feel like the preponderance of evidence certainly weighs on the side of natural origins versus nefarious origins. But I try to be fair and respectful of most people. I don't think I can't pretend that I'm respectful of Donald Trump in the book, but I'm respectful of the scientists who say, well, gain of function research is dangerous, et cetera. Eminent scientists like David Relman and Mark Lipschitz and others. But I try to give people the tools to draw their own conclusions too. And the idea that, yes, it's plausible that somebody, or possible, it's possible that somebody got infected in a laboratory such as the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and then they traveled 9 miles by public transport or perhaps in their car to the Huanan seafood market, and then they had a respiratory crisis and infected a whole bunch of people because there are a whole bunch of cases associated with that market. And then they got on the bus and they went back to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and they infected nobody in that neighborhood, nobody at that institute, and left no trail of having carried that virus to the market. That's possible, but it doesn't seem to me persuasively likely.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and we can see this, the likelihood aspects with other diseases too. That's what's so important, is that there's, and you see this in Spillover and in Breathless too, that there are so many other viral strains out there, whether it's the different coronavirus strains from Breathless, or it's like MERS and SARS and COVID, but even the tons of other ones that don't infect humans yet. But then there's so many others that are out there that have happened in the past and that are currently happening too, that we can just say, well, in none of those cases did anybody say it was a lab leak hypothesis.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although there have been nefarious accusations of people, such as during the plague, against the Jews, for example, in Europe, but they didn't know what they were talking about. Of course, it just so much of that had to do with prejudices that already existed.
And people will always reach for big explanations of big horrible events. You mentioned not just 9/11, but also the Kennedy assassination, John Kennedy's assassination. And I've never researched the 9/11 story. You know more about that than I do, but I've read a lot of books about the Kennedy assassination over the years, beginning back in 1968, when I was a college student, and it was only 5 years in the past. And the first of those books started coming out, and I started reading them. And after having read all those books, the most plausible explanation to me, the strongly supported explanation, is that there was this very disturbed young man, 26 years old, named Lee Oswald, who bought a $19 rifle and managed to get off a couple of lucky shots. All of the other possible explanations do not satisfy the principle of parsimony.
Right. Yeah, and that's why we shouldn't entertain these other ones, like the Building 7 idea for 9/11. Just because this building collapsed doesn't mean that it actually was something that was a controlled demolition, and that the towers would have as well. And so it takes time with this information. I think accumulating the verifiable details, the backgrounds of the hijackers, the in 9/11 case, the background of Oswald too, like, in Oswald's tale in Norman Mailer's book, he look at his whole life story, and even Mailer came out as converted as a result of his own research.
Yeah.
So, and I think people can get that from reading your book too. If they really look at it in an honest way, then you can see that the people who dedicate their lives to this, the scientists that you rightfully highlight, most of which most people haven't heard of too. These people are not doing it for the money. Their research is based on what they really care about, and we should listen to them more so than the people like Rand Paul.
That's right. You mentioned earlier the question of, when we were talking about critical thinking, the question of, ask the question, what is your evidence? Or my simple version, how do you know? But also the question of, what's your expertise?
Yeah.
What are your qualifications to be an expert on this? And if somebody is an optometrist or an economist, then they may be very intelligent, they may be good researchers, but if somebody else is a molecular evolutionary virologist of high reputation, like, for instance, Eddie Holmes at the University of Sydney, who's sort of my gold standard for those people, and his many colleagues, then I find what they say about the evolvability of different viruses and the evidence to be found in a particular genome, I find what they say in general more persuasive.
Absolutely. And the folks at TWIV, that's just such a great service that they're doing 2 times a week. I had Rich Condit on just a week ago too.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Vincent and Rich and their colleagues there. That's a wonderful podcast. This Week in Virology, folks. TWIV, check it out.
Absolutely. And there's such a quantity of data that they cite too, and the kinds of papers that they're reading as they're coming out, the preprints as well as the
Yeah,
published papers and the books too.
right. Yeah, and they sit there with their various guests, and their total, as they would admit, they're total virology nerds. They know a ton about this. Vincent is a professor of virology at Columbia. These people know what they're talking about, and yet they have a very lighthearted, conversational approach to it.
Right. It's almost like they're students at the same time because everybody they interviewed, they want to learn from them. They're not talking over them saying, well, hey, I disagree with this. They really just want to absorb what this person has to say and ask questions and scrutinize it like they're at a conference, but in a friendly manner.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time out again to talk to us. And I tell
Oh,
you, I'm really looking forward to reading what you're doing next. Can you give us a sense of what you're doing?
well, I have another book coming out in May. I'm just dealing with some of the final touches on that right now. It's a book on conservation, biological conservation of biological diversity around the world, what works and what does not. And it is derived from a series of 21 articles that I wrote for National Geographic magazine over the course of 20 years about different conservation projects and efforts around the world, from Congo to Mozambique to Chile and Argentina to the US. And I've pulled these pieces together and I've updated them and I've written connective material and I've written a new forward and a new afterward. And the book is entitled The Heartbeat of the Wild.
Oh, that's great. Wow. Yeah, I love that. The global aspect to it was so enjoyable in both Spillover and in Breathless too. But yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet. And what about that book that you were working on, the connection between viruses and cancers, before you started working on Breathless?
A book about not so much the viral connection there, but generally the evolutionary biology of cancer. Cancer
Okay.
as an evolutionary phenomenon, including the phenomenon that occasionally, under special circumstances, cancer can be transmissible. Cancer can be an infectious disease. Supposedly canonical truth that cancer is not an infectious disease, but it can happen. And not just because cancer can be triggered by a virus and a virus can be contagious, but there are actual cases, including in the Tasmanian devil on the island of Tasmania, southernmost state of Australia, where the Tasmanian devil has been tipping toward extinction because of an epidemic of a contagious cancer, a facial cancer that's passed when they fight with one another over food or over mates.
Oh my gosh.
And I was in Tasmania researching that when this pandemic began. So I pushed all of my sources on that. My books and journal papers are shoved under this desk where I'm sitting right now. On the top of the desk is all this COVID-19 stuff. Under there is the cancer is evolution stuff. And sometime in the course of the next year, I will pull that out and start to work on that book again.
Wow. That's great. I look forward to reading that one as well as your conservation book coming out in next year in late spring. And for those of people who haven't read anything from David Quammen, you really should. There's lots of books out there. I think. Well, how many is there? 12 or 15 so far?
Breathless is number 17.
17. Wow. Right, because you started off as a novelist, right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah. 52 years ago.
Dang. And so you're up in Montana now?
That's right.
Too?
Bozeman, Montana. Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Do y'all get slammed pretty bad by the last
Yeah,
storm?
we got a week or so of that cold air, that massive cold air. It was 20 below in the heat of the afternoon here for a stretch of days. And then I can't remember. It was right before that, I guess we got slammed by the snow, and then we got the cold, and then the cold moved on, and we got temperatures in the 40s, and the snow started to melt. but we still have pretty good snowpack in the mountains. Where are you, Chris? Remind me where you are.
So I'm in Huntington, West Virginia, which is on the Ohio River, right on the Ohio River, pretty much, with bordering with Ohio and Kentucky.
Just downstream from Wheeling?
We are about 3 hours from Wheeling.
Wheeling is not on the river, no.
Oh, it might be actually. I think it is,
One
but it's further up north.
Yeah. Well, I'm a
Yeah.
Cincinnati boy, so
Hey,
so
are you Bengals fan then?
yeah, I am indeed. I am indeed.
Yeah.
And I used to be a Reds fan. They used to have, people don't know this, but they used to have a professional baseball team in Cincinnati.
I know. Gosh. No, I have a story about that too. We were there in September to see a concert in Cincinnati, and it's about a 3 hour drive from us. And the Reds had a game the following day, went by the Reds Stadium, and tickets were going for $8 at that time. They were playing the Rockies. Hardly anybody was there. It's a
Oh,
beautiful
that's
stadium. Yeah.
That's sad.
It
Yeah,
is. It
yeah.
is.
And I shouldn't tease them about that, but they apparently have a business model that just does not include being highly competitive.
Huh. Oh, I see.
I think
That's really too bad. Yeah.
if the ownership wanted to compete, wanted to be in the playoffs, they need to spend more money in this market on players, and apparently they're satisfied somehow with business as usual. Not like back in the great old days of the Big Red Machine, 75, 76, even 1990.
Yeah. When were you living in that area?
I grew up in Cincinnati. I was born there and grew up there. I
Oh.
left in 1966 to go to college and haven't lived there since.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we've gone up there quite a bit, especially because the Bengals are doing so well, and the quarterback is actually from a town about 10 minutes from where my wife grew up,
Joe
too.
Burrow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Joe Burrow is the real deal.
he really is. They're kicking butt
Yeah,
again this
yeah.
year.
That's nice to watch them. Yeah, yeah. Well, you should sometime get on your show Thane Maynard, who's director of the Cincinnati Zoo, who does a
Oh,
lot of things on public radio, is a wonderful guy, wonderful communicator, and knows a lot of interesting things. I recommend him.
I love that zoo too. Cincinnati Zoo is great. Got
Yeah,
some
well,
nice bonobos there, and
yep, yeah,
which not everybody has.
yeah. Well, you should tell Thane I sent you and get him on your show sometime.
I will absolutely. I love animals and evolution and all of that. So it's um, it's been a lot of fun going up there, and it's funny how you have that connection as well. I tend to think that in this modern world, especially 21st century, you're really not that far removed from anybody in the country. You've lived in a similar place that they have because people move around so much,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And a lot of similar interests too, just because we're so mobile.
yeah. It's true. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot again, David, for being
Great
on the
to talk to
show.
you.
Yep, and look forward to talking to you again when maybe when your next book comes out.
I look forward to it too.
All right.
Have a very, very good New Year, Chris.
Thank you. You too, David.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.